For the last week, India has been conducting a complex humanitarian operation in Myanmar. After a devastating earthquake there killed over 2,000 people, India has sent men, materials and resources to help Myanmar recover from this crisis. They're calling it Operation Brahma. Now, you might have noticed that India seems to be doing a lot of this kind of thing recently. Over just the last 6 months, India has sent emergency aid to Vietnam, Vanuatu, Lesotho and Honduras, countries that are spread all over the world. And this isn't an accident. India is actually developing a key diplomatic tool to help its geopolitical rise. And they're calling it disaster diplomacy. On this episode of Threadbare, we explain what disaster diplomacy means and why it's quickly becoming a vital geopolitical asset for India. Over the last 20 years, India has rapidly developed this ability to respond to natural disasters in any part of the world. Even before that, India wasn't a stranger to humanitarian and disaster relief operations. It provided relief to Tibetan refugees fleeing China in 1959. It did the same for Bangladesh during the 1970s when the country was hit by famine and cyclones. It also provided Sri Lanka with relief during its brutal civil war that lasted for over 3 decades. But India's rise as a disaster relief provider really began in 2004. That was the year, you might remember, of the Indian Ocean tsunami, which killed over 200,000 people across Asia, including 16,000 Indians. India, though, responded very quickly to that crisis. It provided large-scale disaster relief assistance to Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and Indonesia. In 2004, India's capacity as a first responder was recognized by other major countries in the region, particularly by the United States. Indian vessels were the first to reach the devastated province of Aceh, which even the Indonesians found difficult to reach, said one senior diplomat. It was then that India realized there were actually big geopolitical advantages to being seen as the most reliable provider of disaster relief in the region. And that was how disaster diplomacy was born. After the Indian Ocean tsunami, India began undertaking relief operations globally. The passage of the 2005 National Disaster Management Act and the creation of the National Disaster Response Force, or the NDRF, allowed India to rapidly increase its capacity to respond to disasters. And the creation of the NDRF is a really big deal because it's one of the world's few standing 24/7 units that is ready to respond to disasters everywhere. After 2005, India began taking on much more of these responsibilities abroad. It ran relief operations in Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, and even in China in response to earthquakes, floods, and other natural disasters. India even sent aid to America after Hurricane Katrina caused widespread devastation there in 2005. However, India's first global operations didn't actually go off all that well. New Delhi's response, for example, to the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan was very tardy, and the NDRF was unable to effectively provide aid to Japan. But by the time of the 2015 Nepal earthquakes, India was able to provide a large-scale relief effort through Operation Maitri. And over the last 10 years, India has undertaken relief operations in almost every neighboring country. It has sent aid to countries in Central America, Africa, West Asia, and a number of other Asian countries. And the question that begs is, why does India do this? Well, first of all, it's because disaster diplomacy actually does bring India some pretty key benefits. First, it allows India to demonstrate its increased geopolitical reach. By responding to crises stretching from Japan to Turkey, New Delhi is showing the world that it is really now a major power. India is sending countries the message that, look, in a time of crisis, we'll be there to support you. This is especially true during the COVID-19 pandemic through India's Vaccine Maitri program. While India's vaccine production program did admittedly have several problems at home, India also did gift several million doses to countries all over the world. And those countries were definitely grateful for those COVID-19 vaccines.
The solidarity that India has demonstrated is an indication of both our deep historical relationship and the promise of two democracies working in this region together. Let me thank Prime Minister Modi and all the government of India for this exceptional act of solidarity and generosity.
One would have thought and understood that in a global pandemic such as this, a nation's size and might would have been the primary considerations. But it is to the credit of Prime Minister Modi that our request was considered on merit and the equality of our people was recognized.
Now, this sort of outreach is extremely helpful in South Asia, where India wants to be seen as the go-to power for a lot of regional countries. Second, states often use disaster aid to achieve breakthroughs in bilateral relationships. For example, India's Operation Maitri during the Nepal earthquake of 2015 played a crucial role in India's outreach to Nepal. India often also helps countries that it isn't too friendly with. For example, it provided emergency relief to Turkey after it was hit by devastating earthquakes in February 2023. Now, this was despite the fact that Turkey's President Erdogan had repeatedly criticized India's handling of the Kashmir situation. Now, this approach hasn't always produced major breakthroughs for India, but it's still worth the effort. India is demonstrating that there is a certain magnanimity when it comes to giving assistance, and that we don't hold grudges when it comes to helping people, said one diplomat. The important thing to note is that India's capabilities are going to be in increasing demand in the near future. Climate change, for example, is triggering natural disasters all across the world, and particularly in India's neighborhood. So here's one estimate that the United Nations came up with. Around 87 million people are going to need humanitarian assistance due to climate-related disasters in South Asia in just this year, 2025. Globally, that could mean hundreds of millions of people will be at risk. Essentially, what the world needs right now is a group of countries that can take the lead and also function as first responders in a time of crisis. And from the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami to the 2025 earthquakes in Myanmar, India has been working on building the capacity to take on exactly that leadership role. As climate change makes the world much more dangerous, it's India's disaster diplomacy that is actually going to make it one of the world's most indispensable providers of security. Thanks so much for watching Threadbare with me, Shashank Matu. You can catch the show next week on India Today Global.